1 through 5. Notice what it says. There is a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-asses and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. You can go and be seated. Let's get right into this morning as we just look at this question, why? Why do the righteous suffer? Rather than just diving into this story in of itself, I want to take the angle of this question, working this out, wrestling with it. And the first observation I see as Job answers this question or wrestles with this question is the question unfolds in verses 1 through 19 with extreme loss. So there's almost like 3 flaps to this story. We're going to look at one flap, verses 1 through 5, a second flap, verses 6 through about verse 12, and then there's going to be a third flap as it unfolds, verses 13 through 19. And so there's 3 different scenes here, and we need to go through this because it's as if the Bible is saying, now, you're asking this question. This is a timeless question asked over the last 4 millennia. Let's go deeper with this question and see what this looks like with a very righteous man losing everything and the pain and agony that goes with that. So notice in verses 1 through 5, Job was a righteous and wealthy man. The Bible makes that very clear. Under inspiration of God, the text says that Job was a perfect and upright man. That word perfect, which we're going to really focus on next week more so than this week, it means complete or whole. He's blameless. It says he's upright, so he had a moral compass that he lived by. And one that feared God. He had a reverence for God. It wasn't in trepidation that God was going to strike him down and his knees were always quaking. No, he had an awe of God, how great he was. And then he avoided evil. He eschewed evil. He stayed clear of that filth in his life. And then notice how blessed he was. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now, some of you are realizing, well, 10 kids, is that a blessing? That's a lot of work, especially you with littles in the house, right? But here's how blessed he was. They had all grown up. There's no dirty diapers. There's no high maintenance, like I got to keep an eye on these kids. They had grown up. And if you read on in this text, they're all getting along peacefully. Like every day they're going to a different sibling's house to feast. The implication is there are 10 different houses. Forget 1 bedroom per kid. How about 1 house per kid? That's how wealthy Job is. And they take turns feasting, and they love each other. There's just this sweet spirit in the home. Boy, that's a far cry from some families that you probably be familiar with, where the siblings, they grow up and they're fighting over, plans or an inheritance, and they just can't get along. That is not the case with Job. He's a blessed man. Even with his kids getting along, there's peace. And notice his wealth here in verses 3 and even verse 4 a little bit, when it talks about the 7,000 sheep and the 3,000 camels and the 500 yoke of oxen. Now a yoke would be 2 oxen each, and so that would be 1,000 cattle. And then 500 she-asses and a very great household. So that, notice in verse 3, that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Everybody knew the name Job. You see the sons and the daughters feasting together in verse 4. They're getting along peacefully. But then it circles around in verse 5, kind of leaving off in verse 1. He's an upright man. He feared God, but he revered God so much that when his kids would get together and then go back to their homes, he was so concerned that there might have been folly. Now, there's no drunkenness, there's no implication they were living immorally or anything like that. But when you get together and have a good time, sometimes words come out that you regret. He's so concerned for his friends, saying, you know what, I need to go and offer another sacrifice for my kids, just in case. This is preventative maintenance. No crises here. I just want to make sure my kids are taken care of, and God's okay with our whole family, even though my kids are grown. You talk about a God-fearing man. Let me put it in modern terms. This man had the wealth of an Elon Musk, but the spiritual fervency of a John MacArthur combined into one man. Can you imagine? And everybody knows who this man is. Now that's the first unfolding. Job was a righteous, wealthy man. But notice it changes scenes and goes up to a spiritual heavenly scene, beginning in verse 6. Now follow with me as I read this. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Now, there's a lot to ask right here. I can't get into all that I studied in the notes that I have on my computer sitting in my office right now, but I want to highlight a couple things right here. First of all, the sons of God gathered together are referring to angelic beings. Now, likely it's referring to mainly the angels of God, but angelic beings could be not only the good angels, but also the fallen angels. And the idea is it's picturing that God is over all the heavenly host, the angelic beings, and they are accountable to Him. Now you say, well, how did this adversary, Satan, as we see here, get into this scene like at God's throne in heaven? Well, it's interesting. If you look at the text, it never says heaven. Now, we can maybe infer that or jump to that conclusion. Maybe that would make sense and so forth. But it actually doesn't necessarily say heaven here. But I don't know all the answers to why Satan was in this, other than the point of the author is God is sovereign even over Satan, the adversary. And I believe that's the point that he's making here, even though we may not be able to answer all those questions on why would he be appearing before God. No, the point is this: God is all-powerful, even over somebody like Satan. Now, the word Satan literally means adversary or opponents. And when we picture Satan, we picture somebody that has horns and a pitchfork and is red and evil-looking and just a menace to look at. But that's not the description given in Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. He was created as an archangel. According to Ezekiel 48, he led the heavenly choir. He knew music. He was highly talented and gifted. He was beautiful to look at, to the point when he rebelled against God and said, I will be like the Most High. And God says, no, you won't. According to Revelation, a third of the angels went with him. That's how beautiful he was. He had quite the influence in heaven. So as he comes before God here, we're not talking about this evil villain that looks, don't even look at him. No. All eyes are upon this beautiful being who's standing before God. Now, he's the elephant in the room. He stands out from everybody else. Like, what is the adversary doing before God? And so, what does God do? He calls out the elephant in the room. What are you up to, Satan? That's basically in modern vernacular what God asks. And notice the answer: going to and fro throughout the whole earth. Now, compare Scripture with Scripture. You see a similar phrase in the New Testament in describing the devil or Satan, and that's 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. We don't have time to turn there. I'm just going to quote it for you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about to and fro." Huh? Similar? But the verse isn't done. "Seeking whom he may devour." So when you see this phrase in Job 1, it's not just saying, oh yeah, he's just kind of going along, seeing what's going on in the world. No, he's seeking to devour people. He wants to bring accusations against the people of God. He wants to undermine the character of God. He wants to gain the upper hand. That's what it is given by implication here in verse 7. Now notice how God seemingly baits Satan when he says in verse 8, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil," almost word for word in the Hebrew as verse 1. You see it there, even in our English? So this is how Job is introduced. God Almighty, who knows the hearts of all men, sets the record straight at the outset. Job is a righteous man. God says so. All the people on earth that know Job are saying so. The record is clear throughout this whole initial unfolding that Job is a righteous man in the eyes of God. But notice how Satan responds to this. Verse 9. "Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught or for nothing?" In other words, I believe he looks to you, God, and it's meaningless. It's vain. What do you mean by that? The reader's asking. Well, verse 10 explains, "Hast not thou made an hedge about him?" Now, when I use the word hedge, we're not talking about hedges that you just kind of block off like boxwoods. We're not talking about boxwoods. We're talking like a massive wall, maybe to separate close lanes of the freeway so that like 18-wheelers don't go into the other lane. We're talking, it's going to keep danger away. And so he's saying, hey, you have this major protection around Job. It goes on and says, "And about all that he hath on every side. Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land." Now look at verse 11. "But put forth thine hand and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." Now, this is what he's saying, and then I want to tell you what's implied here. He's saying, Job's fear of you is worthless because you've never tested him. Now, when he says, you touch his goods, you take away his goods, and he's going to curse you to your face, he's basically accusing God of saying, the only reason he fears you is because you bribe him to do so. Because he knows that you're blessing him, and because the blessing is coming, of course he's going to fear you. But you stop blessing him, or it feels like he's not being blessed, that's going to all turn, and it's going to show that the only way you can have followers, God, is to bribe them. That's the only way you have people dedicated to you. Quite an accusation of God. So this isn't primarily an accusation against Job. It's an attack on the character of God, saying, people really don't love you, God, for who you are. They only love you for the gifts you offer them. And when those gifts stop, they curse you to your face. Now, that's a description of a lot of people, unfortunately, over the last several millennia. Like as soon as God takes something away, they do curse God. Satan knows that. He's going to operate by that strategy. May that not be the case for any of us here this morning when God touches what we have. Satan knows that's the tendency, the human tendency in all of us. But he is attacking the character of God and saying, the only way you can get people to worship you is to bribe them and to pay them off. Then you have followers. You stop paying them off, they feel like they're not being paid anymore, they're done. Now, how's God going to respond to this? I love how he doesn't argue, he doesn't debate. He just says, okay, verse 12, And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Now, there's so much here when it comes to theology and doctrine. Basically, he says, okay, Satan, you can have your way. But, here's the hedge, don't touch him. Don't you love the way God sets the parameters? Satan does not. He's the one who puts the hedges around. He draws the parameters, and Satan has to submit to the parameters of God. He can never go beyond what God would ordain. Doesn't that give you comfort and hope this morning? The fact that our God would be that powerful to accomplish a good plan that's unfolding? So a couple takeaways before we go any further to the third flap that's unfolding here is this. Satan the adversary is out to get you to curse God. He wants to undermine the character of your father by going after you so that you would say, God's not good. I'm angry at God. Can't stand that he would do this. I don't deserve this, God. And Satan just dances away from that sight with glee when his followers succumb to that. And so when we look at the New Testament, it says, seeking whom he may devour, that's what he has in mind. He wants to get his people to be angry at God, to doubt his goodness, and ultimately to curse him. That's mission accomplished for Satan because that undermines the character of God. It makes God to be out somebody who is just bribing his followers. They're only following you because of your blessing, God. Only because of the way there's material, like tangible stuff that they have in their life. As long as they got their stuff, they're happy. Take away their stuff, they're not going to bless you anymore and worship you. But then there's Satan acting upon this. So we see two occurrences. Job was righteous and wealthy. That's the first flap that opens here as this unfolds. And then the second one, okay, there's this heavenly scene. And by the way, Job has no idea this is going on. This adds to the suspense. He's just going along, faithful each day, making sure the operations are in full swing. And then we have the third fold that comes out here, beginning in verse 13. Look at what it says. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. So things are just going along. Can you just imagine? Job has no idea about this heavenly conversation. He wakes up one morning, he stretches, he looks out the window, and there are the oxen plowing. Okay? Servants and hired hands are already on it. Looks off in the hills and sees the camels out there. They're the sheep grazing. He can hear laughter. His kids are all hanging out at the older son's house. This is going to be a good day. But then he hears footsteps. Footsteps on the threshold of the house. That's not normal. Usually, the hired hands are out there operating, taking care of business. Why is somebody coming up to the house? There must be something wrong. Well, look at what it says in verse 14. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. In other words, Job, all those cattle, all the donkeys that you had, they're gone. The Sabeans, which were an outlier party that necessarily didn't have much power, but nonetheless, they would operate from the fringes, and here they came in on the fringes, and they killed Job's servants watching the oxen and the donkeys, and steal all the donkeys, every single one of them. Well, he's recovering from that bad news, and here comes more footsteps along the threshold of his house. And it says in verse 16, while he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So what happened to the oxen and the donkeys now happened to the sheep. But this isn't necessarily the Sabeans. This is like divine. Fire comes down from heaven. This seems to be like from God himself. A lightning strike in the middle of the sheep grazing, and they are all killed through this fire, as well as the shepherds overwatching them, except for this one messenger who's come back to Job. But if that wasn't enough, here comes more footsteps coming towards Job, getting louder and louder and louder. Verse 17. And while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So what the Sabians did in a couple verses before, now the Chaldeans are doing in 3 bands. So this is obviously some strategy going on here. There's a conspiracy. And they fell upon the camels and have carried all them away and just executed or murdered all the servants involved. Now, at this point, it's been all of his stuff. The equivalent is, in modern day, the house is burned down, you've lost all your stuff, and you have no insurance to cover all this. You have nothing material left. Your shop, all the tools in the shop, men, all the things you've invested, it's gone. And there's no way to just instantly replace all this. You're starting over. But then the most tragic set of footsteps approaches Job. And we read in verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. Well, Job knew that. He heard the laughter earlier that morning. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. This is the worst. It's not a matter of just losing one child. All 10 children gone in a moment. As I read this, and as I even just sat in this sanctuary earlier this week and looked out at the empty pews, I thought of some of you and the suffering you've gone through. Losing a spouse, losing a child, losing a loved one to suicide, losing a business, losing your innocence at an early age through somebody who took advantage and preyed upon you. I know some of you have gone through horrendous suffering that is beyond my imagination, and maybe the imagination of others. But God is laying down an example here through Job to say there's someone in the Bible that can identify. Because through all the suffering you might have gone through, I don't think anybody would say, I've had a day like Job, where I lost everything I owned and all 10 of my children, and the only person I had left was my wife, and you're going to find out in the next chapter that she's no support. She's griping and complaining and saying, just curse God and die. And we see in the scriptures by implication some empathy here, some identity. In other words, God is the one who inspired this, and let me just hit the pause button for a moment. God can identify with your suffering. He knows what you're going through. He empathizes with that. And we're going to come back to that at the end as we see Job's response here in just a few moments. But I just want you to know that this is not removed from your situation. This reminds us that God is not some transcendent God way off in a different universe, just watching from a distance, just kind of seeing how things pan out with your suffering and how you cope with this. No, this is a God who cares. He's close. He wants to be near. He can empathize. He hurts himself. And here he is inspiring this book of Job to say, there's been very few people in the last 4 millennia, if any, that have suffered as much as Job did in this one day. I believe one point we can see in chapter 1 so far is God can identify with suffering, and he pictures this through Job. We're all together so far? Now, back to that question. Why would God allow good things or bad things to happen to good people? Why do the righteous suffer? Now we see the question that's unfolded in the story of Job. And at this point, I want an answer, don't you? Okay, you've unfolded the question, God. What's the answer? That's the question we want to ask. it's almost as if God is saying, yeah, I want you to wrestle with that question. But you know what? I'm going to take it a different direction. I'm going to leave that question unanswered. I'm going to rather give you a different answer. It's as if God is playing Jeopardy, if you will. He's giving you the answer so that you can come up with a question accordingly. And the answer that he gives is not the answer to the question of, why do the righteous suffer? The answer is, let me show you a stellar response, which takes us back to the question of, not why do the godly suffer, but rather the question is, how should we respond to suffering? How do you handle that? How do you grapple with that? How do you navigate that painful road of suffering? And we're going to see the answer here that he gives and trace it back to that question I just put out there to you. And really the second thought that we see, the question is unanswered with a stellar response. Now notice Job's response in a threefold way. First of all, in verse 20, the example shouts, in suffering, still worship God. In suffering, still worship God. Look what it says in verse 20. Then Job arose and rent his mantle, and shaved his head, and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. Now, in the Hebrew, there are five verbs total. 5 actions that Job takes. And you can almost see the build, and it's almost like anticlimax for the good. Now follow the logic here of the text. In verse 20, it says, now, Job arose. So that means that, man, this floored him. This knocked the life out of him. We're talking about, for those of you who watched Saving Private Ryan a couple decades ago when that came out, Mrs. Ryan receiving the news of the loss of her boys. Just takes her out on the front porch. No more spirit in him, in Job, in this scene. You say, how do you know that? Because he has to get up. He has to rise up now. That's the first action he takes, which, by the way, probably took every ounce of strength in him just to get back on his feet after hearing that news. And he rent his mantle. I mean, this is a nice robe. He's one of the greatest men of the East. This isn't a Walmart t-shirt. He takes this mantle and he rips this mantle to show his grief and his sorrow. And then he shaves his head. He's removing his glory, his respect. And then, what's the fourth verb? He fell down upon the ground again. Can you picture him? Garment rent, head shaved, prostrate on the ground. And it's as if it's building towards, why, God? Why? How can you do this to me? Nobody has it worse than I do right now. That's the build. I believe that's the intent of the author here. It's building to this point where we're going to see Job shake his fist at God and curse him. But the word in the Hebrew and that we see in our English language is not, he cursed God, he was angry at God. No, he worshiped. Wow. That's the whole point of this verse. Build. This is what's going to happen. Satan's going to win. He's going to curse God. Oh, he worshiped? He worshiped God? Who does that when they've lost so much? The point that I want to see before we move any further is that he let go of personal respect so that his God would continue to increase. He let go of any sense of entitlement that he had to all that he owned so that his God could still be big and have his way. He was living what John the Baptist would later declare in John chapter 3, verse 30, he must increase, but I must get low and decrease. How could he have this mindset? Job knew how to get a grasp of his ego. You say, what do you mean by that? Let me just talk about us for a moment in relationship to Job. See, Job had this mindset. He knew what he really deserved. Do you know what you really deserve? You know what I really deserve? While we are made in the image of God, we have gone far from God. We've strayed from him. God is perfect. We see that in the Ten Commandments. He gives a perfect moral code. We all fall short of that moral code in our thoughts and our heart and our desires and just some of the impulses we have. We'd be ashamed of if we published that across the board and the church family or the neighborhood hear about that. And what we deserve is the destination without God. And so when you look at what Job and we deserve, the mindset is anything more than that is a blessing. It's His grace. It's undeserved. This is a far cry from our ego that says, I did right, I deserve to be blessed. I worked hard, I deserve my reward. God owes it to me. There's none of that in Job whatsoever. That's the only way he could worship God. So we see this first response is he worshiped God, but notice secondly in verse 21, trust God's ownership. Trust God's ownership. Look at what it says. And he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord had taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Let me put it in modern terms. Hey, I arrived in this world as a naked baby. I didn't have anything. When my life is over, I'm going to exit the same way. So, in between, the Lord has given a few things. He's going to take it away eventually anyway. He just chose to do that right now. Blessed be the name of the Lord. 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul echoes the same idea when he wrote to a young preacher named Timothy, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. Only when we hold our stuff and possessions lightly will we be able to bless God when it's gone. When we cling to the stuff that we have and feel like that's what life is worth living for, that's the purpose, that's the mission, that next purchase, that new release of the iPhone, that new piece of technology, that's what I want. And it consumes our thinking, and that's what we feel like we deserve. When it's gone, our life, or at least our heart, crumbles like just a house of cards because we're clinging tightly to what we have. Now, I realize that many of you would be aware, at least mentally, and I'm of that camp as well. Yeah, it's not about stuff. It's not about stuff. It's about people. It's about relationships. But Job is also saying this about his family, about his kids. That's the tough one. Because many of you are with me. The house can burn down. The stuff can go. Don't touch my kids. We want to say that to God as well. And he still has this mindset. Thank God for these few years I had with my kids. I didn't arrive with my kids. I'm not going to leave with my kids. I thank God for the time I got with them. What a mindset. So worship God. Trust God's ownership. In other words, hold everything, including our families, loosely. But then, notice number 3, refuse to accuse God. Refuse to accuse God. Look at what it says. In all this, Job sinned not, verse 22, nor charged God foolishly. He maintained his righteousness that Job had described in chapter 1, verse 1. God had described later on in about verse 6 and 7, or verse 8. He maintained this righteousness. He lived the life so that James would later write about him in James chapter 5, verse 11. Ye have heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord. Now, what is so ironic at this point? We can safely imply this. Everything, humanly speaking, it's heading towards Job, cursing God and saying, why, God, why? And yet the only one left cursing at the end of chapter 1 is Satan himself. He's the one cussing up a storm as he heads out of the throne room of heaven, angry that this didn't work with Job. Ironic, isn't it? And by the way, by implication, we can say, as one friend of mine said 25 years ago, never let the devil have the satisfaction in your life. Job lived that. There's no satisfaction that Satan could have over Job in his response. Now let's work this out. We're not done yet, okay? So don't close your Bible. We still have a little ways before we approach the runway here. So hang in there just a bit longer. We've seen this story unfolding. The question unfolds with extreme loss. Then he doesn't answer that question. Rather, it remains unanswered and instead gives a stellar response of worshiping God, trusting God's ownership, and refusing to accuse God. But years ago, I read about a true account. It happened over 40 years ago in a Massachusetts hospital. A little preschool boy named David who walked in with some pain and discomfort, and through a series of tests, he was diagnosed with leukemia. Dr. John Truman in the hospital was the physician assigned to him, and he began doing treatment, and it was very painful. Every time this little boy preschooler would come in and be stuck with needles, the nursing staff would try to be so friendly, and he tried to be upbeat as much as he could, but I mean, there was a dread in little David's heart. But a year into treatment, the leukemia was still having its way. Dr. Truman said he needs a spinal tap. It's going to be more invasive. Now, spinal taps are horrendously painful for anybody of any age. And they took little David in there, and his mommy, Deborah, sat down with David after talking to Dr. Truman and said, now, David, this is going to hurt. This is going to hurt. But the hurt is a reminder that we love you and we want to treat this disease. Well, the best he could, the little preschool nodded his head. The procedure began, and he writhed in pain. He yelled. He was in anguish. It took 3 nurses to hold him down as he went through this painful procedure. Finally, towards the tail end, when sweat was pouring down this little boy's face, and it was starting to subside just a little bit, he looked up at the doctor and said, thank you, Dr. Truman, for my hurting. What trust that somebody had that response to the pain. Little David is following in the footsteps of Job. And Job in this story doesn't understand why. Why am I suffering? Why am I going through this? But he's looking up to God saying, I trust you, God, with this hurting. You're doing something that I can't see here. So why do the righteous suffer? Let's go full circle. Why do the righteous suffer? The answer is God knows the answer. So trust Him with it. He doesn't give the answer. You can read the remaining 41 chapters. He never answers that question. I know it drives us crazy. Why would He not answer this question? Probably because we couldn't handle the answer. Instead, He says, I got the answer. I got a purpose. I'm doing something here. Would you just trust me through this? Now, I realize the skeptical side of me kicks in. Maybe you get a little skeptical of this. This almost sounds like a totalitarian regime, that leads their people in. They don't have the answers. They don't know what's going on. And they abuse people like it's power control, isn't it? Well, we can maybe say that about God in chapter 1, but as the whole story unfolds into chapter 2, we see that God very much cared for Job in the end. He preserved Job. He blessed Job. There was the justice of God that went into play. We can't look at our God and say, He is just this tyrant that takes control of people and keeps them in the dark about things. No. God is a good God, and we see that through the whole book of Job, especially in chapter 42. But our emotions would constantly scream and question the goodness of God when we suffer. Your emotions have questioned the goodness of God. My emotions have been tempted to shake the fist at God when we go through certain situations, relationally, physically, emotionally, mentally. And if you turn over to Job chapter 23, We see Job going through this, where his emotions are heavy, and we're going to see in the coming chapters that Job is like an emotional roller coaster going up and down, all over the place. He almost disagrees with himself. I mean, he says one thing in one chapter and seems to say something totally different in another chapter because he's on this emotional ride up and down throughout this whole book. But he has it right on here in Job chapter 23, verse 10. You have it there. When you have Job chapter 23, just say amen. All right, so I want you to see this firsthand. Notice with me in Job chapter 23, I don't want to just look at one verse that's in my notes here. I want to look at a couple verses here leading up to this. Job chapter 23, and we look at verse 8. Notice what the scriptures say. Follow along silently as I read it out loud. Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand, where he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. But he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. If you write in your Bible, there's one word you could put right there: trust. I don't see it. I don't feel it. The emotions are crying something totally differently right now, but I'm going to trust God's revelation of himself, and he will bring me forth a better man, a better woman than I am right now. I don't know what that's going to entail. I don't know what he's doing right now, but I'm going to trust God that he knows what he's doing. Now, going back to our sister who is suffering right now with the loss of her husband and the news behind that loss of her husband. And a reminder we ought to be praying for our sister and just be begging God to give that family grace. She sent out an email. Some of you are on that email list. They came out Friday. So this is public knowledge. This isn't something that is just private information. We're breaking confidence here. She emailed this out, and this is how she concluded this news. And I just want to read that to you this morning. Just the trust in this sister in response to this agonizing news. I do know someone else who was betrayed by the most unlikely person in the group. He it is who knows our deepest hurts and feels our deepest pains. He it is who was kissed by the one who sold him into the hands of those who would ultimately kill him. And while we know the end of the story of Judas, there is still hope for Ollie. So, here's the trust. I pray for Ollie. I'm trusting God with this. I'm not angry at Ollie. I'm not bitter about the disloyalty and the betrayal. I'm trusting that God will work through this. Now, regardless of what you have been through and what you're going through this morning, I want you to know the best news this morning. It's not just a God up in heaven who can identify with you. It's not just a man from 4 millennia ago who can identify with you. God sent his son Jesus to suffer an agonizing death for your sin, because we're the ones who have strayed, like I mentioned before. And he went through the pain and agony of taking your sin upon himself. That's something beyond words that none of us can comprehend, the suffering he went through. He died a criminal's death, was buried for 3 days, and burst forth from that grave to show that he's victorious, not only over sin, but over the suffering involved in sin. But I want you to know that that same Jesus he can save your soul. He can change you from the inside out. Your debt has been paid. But also, he can identify. He's been there and done that. He knows pain far beyond what you've experienced, and he is in your corner to identify with you. He just simply asks for you to believe, to trust, to turn to him. Let's go and stand with heads bowed and eyes closed.